Working. Got it. Huh? It's working. Got it. Huh? Wait, can you post this link to the Facebook page?
Oh yeah, can you just send it to me?
This is June's computer, so I don't really.
I mean, can you take a picture and send it to me then on your phone?
Wait, can you Facebook message this link to Lily?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
can you
Victoria.
post this link?
Or I could do that with Victoria. Yeah, I don't know if we're friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, just yeah.
Yes,
Wait, did you
I
copy
can.
it?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Thank you so much, June.
No problem.
Wait, can you Facebook message this link to Lily? Okay.
Or I could do that with Victoria. Yeah, I don't know if we're friends.
Yes.
Yeah, I just sent it to you. No problem. Yeah, I just sent it to you. Okay, so we'll get started. Can everybody hear me okay? If I talk like this? Is that cool? I'll jump on the mic for the demo, but I'm not a huge fan of sitting and talking. So, I'm June. I'm a fifth year dual degree studying physics and music composition. And I'm going to talk about React today. So we'll start with a little bit of overview, what the framework actually is, why it's cool, why a lot of people use it. We'll dive into a little bit of conceptual stuff. I'll show you a demo on my computer, and then you guys can get hacking away with a cool tutorial that's online. Sound good? All right, let's rock and roll. So, the React is a JavaScript framework, as you guys all know. It's kind of like Angular or Vue or whatever else you might have heard online that's popular these days. But as you can see, it is one of the most popular ones. It was actually voted the most popular one in 2017. The reason it's cool is, well, a lot of things, but the main draw here is that it's component based. So the way you build web apps with React is not by writing HTML pages and then like adding logic to them as you would normally do with other frameworks. You have these modular components that you can write, and they do their own thing. They're all compartmentalized, and you can plug and play them. You can reuse them over and over. It makes life easy. It makes your development think that's one of the main draws. It is created by engineers at Facebook, and it's open source. So if you guys are into that, you guys can contribute. It's also very popular. It's got a great community online, as well as a really, really good set of native docs, documentation, and tutorials. So that's also a giant plus for our framework. It's known to be very fast. It's got this buzzwordy thing called virtual DOM, but it actually really is a cool concept where instead of redrawing everything, on the actual DOM itself, when you have to change something, it changes what's called a virtual DOM. So your changes are fast. You never have issues of things lagging behind, etc. So yeah, those are some traits of React. I should emphasize it's a Vue library, so it's not like Django or like Rails where you have the whole structure, whole architecture. It is only for the front end. It's meant for UI, so just keep that in mind. I want to go over some prerequisites before we dive in. So I do expect you to have some knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. You guys can still probably follow along. You might still miss a little bit of syntax here and there, and some terms I throw around, but if you have dealt with HTML, CSS, or JavaScript at a basic level, you guys should be able to follow along, no problem. If you don't know those prerequisites, I would recommend going to Codecademy and putting up those tutorials. They're really great. They're interactive. They let you code on the fly. You can learn them pretty quickly. So I would recommend doing those first if you're a total beginner. If you need some refresher on JavaScript, you haven't, you've used it before, but you haven't done it in a while or whatever. Mozilla has a really good reintroduction article, so you might want to give that a skim before we dive into the last part today. But yeah, so let's talk about more of the concepts associated with actually making a web app with React. So say I'm building a homepage, right? So I have this page, very simple, straightforward, and normal website building like with HTML would be just this page. You would call it like index.html, right? Throw in some CSS, whatever, have some content, have some title, right? Very straightforward. And then I decide, okay, I want to make a different page and showcase my favorite movies on there. Okay, so now I have a movies page that looks kind of like this, right? And then you got the same sort of title, you got similar content, right? And it looks generally the same. Now it's starting to become more of a real website. Say I want to add functionality, right, to make it actually interactive. So then I add a menu. So that's a navigation bar you see in every single website ever, right? So then we've got these buttons that'll take you to different pages. Let's say I have some more pages that you can go to, et cetera, et cetera. And then I realized, okay, well, if I put a menu on the front page, I'd probably put the same thing on the second page, right? So then I start having to either copy and paste the code over, the HTML, blah, blah, blah. This is where, when you start getting to real interactivity in websites, this is where React comes in handy. So instead of having to do, copy and paste, put the menu over, and then realize it's later, I want to add another button, and then I have to do that to all of the other ones, you can turn these into components. And this is what happens in React, right? So say the title is a component on its own. So then it'll have, the font built into it, or the style built into it rather, and the background color and whatever, and you just give it the actual title that you want, and then you can reuse that component in all the different pages, and it'll look the same, right? It'll just have different content. Same with the menu, right? So you can build it once, and then you can just put that component in all the different pages. You don't have to worry about it. If you make a change in the nav, then it'll get updated on all the different pages. And inside that component might be 4 different button components, which are all the same base component, just have different text on them, etc. You guys get the idea here? Yeah. So this makes life a lot easier for a lot of different cases. You can kind of imagine, all the different types of features on a website that this would make sense for, which is essentially everything, right? You saw the title and nav in action, but also there are headers, footers, right? Sidebars. There are UI elements like buttons, you can kind of imagine banners, what have you. All of this can be just written as a single component, reused, and people even do this as just frameworks libraries. You can look up pre-built, off-the-shelf, for example, material design React libraries. You can pull off all these UI elements and put it right in your website. Save you a lot of time. So instead of talking at you guys more, let's look at React in action IRL. So I'm sure you guys all know this website. Let's see if I can do this. look at React in action.
I'm gonna turn that
IRL.
screen.
So I'm sure you guys all know this website. Okay, so I'm sure you guys know this website. What you might not know is that this website is actually built with React. So I have React Chrome developer tools enabled, which means, see if we can make this bigger. Which means if I go to the dev environment here, and say I want to like inspect one of these components, I go to this handy little React tab, which means if I go to the dev environment, and then look at all those components that are nested inside each other, right? So, I'm gonna read this. I go to this handy little React tab. So here's a component called refinement card, right? And that's, you can see it kind of highlights that one little box called homes, right? So this is a component that Airbnb engineers have made and put inside React. And don't get intimidated by the layers of nesting. You know, there are, like a real website would have tons of like nested layers inside it, but you're not going to be writing all of this code that you see here. A lot of this is generated by the compiler. A lot of this is generated JavaScript, so you wouldn't actually be writing all of this. But the idea still you can see, right? So to kind of drive it home, let's search for components named refinement card. You're not going to be writing all of this code that you see here. A lot of this is generated by the compiler. A lot of this is generated JavaScript. So if I hover over some of these, right, you can see that there are multiple instances of this component being used. And they just have different inputs, right? This one just says experiences, this one says home, this one has restaurants, right? You can kind of see here where that's being fed in. Does that make sense? So yeah, this is React in action in real life. So I'm gonna move to a demo so we can actually see some of this coded and see what it looks like in code. Does that make sense? So yeah, this is React in action in real life. So I'm gonna mirror displays so we don't have to worry about. Demo. So we can actually see some of this coded and see what it looks like in code. So yeah, this is React. Okay. Displays so we don't have to worry about. So let's start simple, right? All we have is just a little div with HTML in it. Or HTML with a div in it. Talking is hard. And all we have is just ID, call it root. And we're going to start adding React to this simple HTML. So the first thing we need is something called React DOM. And this object has a render function. And this takes in two inputs. The first input it's going to take is the actual React component itself, which we So the first thing we need is something called React DOM. And this object has a render function. Can you read it? A little bigger, maybe? This takes in two inputs. The first input it's going to take is the actual React component. Yeah, so it's going to take in two components. The first component is the actual, or two inputs. The first is the actual React component itself. So we haven't written that yet, but we're going to call that in tradition hello world. And this is what writing a component looks like. This is how you represent a component in React. This is something called JSX syntax, which I will get into in a second. But the second input to this function, we use vanilla, like normal JavaScript, to just grab the actual div itself. And how we're going to do that is using the ID. So if you've done JavaScript before, you know how this works. But the second input to this function, we use vanilla, like normal JavaScript. And of course, the ID is root. Okay, pretty anticlimactic. Nothing happened, but that's because we haven't written the hello world function yet, right? But this is super important because you'll see this in every web app. This is how you actually connect the React itself to the HTML, right? Okay. You'll see that I'm not doing any imports or any fancy changes like that, or fancy things like that, because we're in a CodePen environment, and you guys later on will be working in a CodePen environment too, so no need to worry about like all this setup and stuff. Once you guys actually start applying this to your own projects, that's something you can read more about online, but today is more focused on the actual React syntax and tools, so definitely want to get that across faster. So
let's write a real component. So here's what that looks like. So React component is most often a class. And if you know object orientism, you know that in classes you can extend things from parent classes. And every single React class is going to inherit from this React.components parent class. And this is something that is automatically imported as well, right? So here's our name. That's what we're calling the component, hello world. And every React component has a render method, and inside it, as you might guess by the name, all it does is just return something that you want it to render. So if I do this, you guys can probably all guess what's going to happen. And every React component has a render method, and inside it, as you might guess by the name, all it does is just return something that you want it to render. So if I do this, you guys can probably all guess what's going to happen. Sorry. There we go. So that popped up as expected, right? And you see that this is basically HTML right here that I've returned. Not quite. So this is what's called JSX. And this is cool syntax that at most times looks basically just like HTML. But the interesting thing is you can actually write JavaScript right inside it. So if you put some curly braces in and say like, put a JavaScript string inside there, you'll see it appear, right? So you can get it rendered right there. You can even, like normal JavaScript, right? If you do name and then call, my name is June, right? So we have variable name declared, and then if we put that variable right inside, you'll see my name up there. So you can see this is just normal JavaScript that you can insert right inside the render function in HTML looking syntax that looks like HTML, and just by using curly braces. So this is really useful. You'll see it coming pretty handy in a short bit, but we'll leave this pretty straightforward for now. Does everybody follow up to this point? Great, yeah. So let's write our very second React component, and we're going to call this display name. The header looks the same. Straightforward for now. And again, we have another render function. So let's write our very second. And this time we're going to return a header. We're going to call it my name is. The header looks the same. And then June. And again, we have another render function. You'll notice above here I've used multi-line syntax, so I have parentheses. You don't always need it if it's just one line. It's pretty straightforward right now, so I'm just going to put all in one line. It's the same thing. And you might wonder, okay, so how do we display this on the actual HTML? Well, what we want to do is take this display name component and we want to nest it inside the hello world component. And I want to say I want to display it right below what's actually already there. Does anybody know what I would type to make that happen? Well, what we want to do is take this display name component and we want to I'll give you a hint. Take a look at the very last line. And I want to say I want to display it. I'm sure some of you can take a guess. What's actually already there. Does anybody know what I would type to make that happen? Well, it's gonna look like this. I'll give you a hint. Take a look at the very last line. Now, there's a little caveat in React where the top level return element always has to be wrapped in one single element. So most often that's a div. And so after we've done that, now we get the display name element nested within the hello world component. And it's displaying right below this paragraph tag. Does everybody get what happened there? Cool. So now we have this display name component, but say like somebody else wants to use this display name component. And obviously not everybody's name is June, so that's not going to be useful to everybody. So just like functions, what you can do is you can have components take inputs, and what those are called in React is props, or standing for properties, right? So let's replace my name with some JavaScript, and I'm going to write this. Just like functions, what you can do is you can have. So what's happening here is I'm substituting it with a variable called this.props.name. So this keyword refers to the instance of the actual object, right? If you know object-oriented programming, that's just means like when you use this display name class, this keyword refers to that instance of that class, yeah? And then props is just properties. You can think of it as the function's arguments or inputs, however you want to think about it. And then name is just a specific value of that we choose, right? So then we can go up here where we use the display name component and say
props is just properties. You can think
name
of it
is
as
June,
the function's argument,
and voila.
inputs, however you want
There's
to
that input appearing, right?
And the name is
So what's happening again is whatever you specify here, name, right? Like if I say Chris, then that gets fed into this dot props, and then it just gets displayed within the component. So this is how you pass information through different components from top level on down, right? And it's important to remember this because in React, one of the main principles of building web apps is information should always go top down, which means when you start nesting, right? Remember those like nested components in the Airbnb app? You should always have information come from the topmost one, spreading down to the more nested levels. And that's how information should be passed in a full React app. Great. So there's one caveat that we should discuss before moving on. This is a very straightforward component, right? It doesn't do much. All it does is like take some input and then return, some output. Does anybody know what the computer science word for that is? Like a function that just takes input and just gives out output, does nothing else.
take some input and then return,
Not quite.
Does anybody know what the computer science
It's a
word
pure function, if you heard of that. Yeah, I think somebody said it. So any class that you can think of as like a pure function, you can literally write as a JavaScript function, and that's the standard. So we're gonna rewrite this as a function.
Not quite. Does anybody know what the computer science
It's a pure function, if you heard of that. Yeah, I think somebody said it.
so
And all we're gonna do is do the
any-
exact
any
same thing.
class that you can think of as like a pure
My
function, you
name
can
is,
literally
and this
write
time we're not using the
as a
this
function.
keyword
That's the
because
standard.
it's
So
not
we're
an
gonna
object
rewrite
anymore,
this
right? It's just a function. So we just do props, as you can see in the input of the function there, dot name. And all we're gonna do is do the exact same thing. And otherwise, it looks exactly the same.
And this
right?
time we're not
So
using the this
and
keyword
anytime
because
you have a
it's not an
React
object
component that all it does is render stuff from input, you just write it as a function. And if we get rid of the other one, it does the exact same thing. It works just the same, right? Okay, so now we know the two ways to write an actual function. Let's do something more useful, because web apps need something called state, right? Like if you have something dynamic, maybe you want to press a button, maybe you want to keep track of time, whatever. Like all the interesting stuff is going to be powered by the web app state. And the nice thing about React is that if you've ever built a web app with like jQuery vanilla JavaScript and some HTML, you know that like when you start adding dynamic stuff to your websites, it gets a little hairy, right? You have to like listen for events, you have to handle them, you have to make sure they're updated, make sure the view is updated correspondingly, and make sure it happens every single time. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff in React because every single component has its own state in React. And that state will be taken care of by React itself. Whenever the component is created on screen, that state will be initialized. It'll live on through the lifetime of that component, and it'll die. Garbage collection will happen automatically, right? So it's really nice. It's really automatic, and there's a lot less to think of. It's more intuitive. So I'll show you how that works. So we're gonna write another class. It's gonna be a button, but we're gonna call it click me. And so again, if we have a component that has state, we should be using a class to write it, not a function, right?
I'll show you how that works. So we're gonna write.
So we have a normal render function, just like the other ones. Let's say that we want the button to be, I don't know, just say click me, I guess. Then we can render this right below all the other ones that we have up here. So click me. Let's say. And voila, a button appears. You can click it. Doesn't really do anything right now, but it is a button, right? Cool. So let's add some dynamic stuff to this. So the first thing we should do is write a constructor. So if you, again, have learned object-orientism, like constructor is just a function that gets called every time you initialize an instance of that object, right? So in React, that's what this is.
Write a constructor. So
and every constructor has to have a call to super, passing in props. Whoops, I forgot to put props as a input there. So that's going to be the first two lines of every constructor in React. And then we're going to declare the actual state of this component. So we're going to say this dot state. Again, this referring to the instance of this click me object, right? So in that case, so now state of every React object is going to be a JavaScript object. And we're going to call this state button on seems appropriate. And we want to start with the button off, so we'll initialize it to false. So this is like, you'll see this in pretty much every dynamic React component that you stumble upon, right? This dot state, and you initialize, you know, some bunch of state values to describe what the app is doing at that point in time, right? So obviously we can't interact with this state yet because clicking this doesn't actually do anything, and the state is static. So let's write a handler that'll actually help us connect the clicking to the changing of the state. So we can write a nice little prop called onClick, and this is built into React. So onClick is one of the most popular, you know, most often used tools in React. And then all we do, instead of like in HTML where you would feed it like literally a string, all you do is you feed it a function in JavaScript. And the standard here is to just call it a handle and then whatever you're handling. So in this case, handle click, right? And then we should make sure that we have a this keyword in front of it because again, this function is going to be a method of this instance, right? So then let's actually write this handler. So we can do handle click. And when you click the button, what we want it to do is change the state so that it is the opposite of whatever the current state is. Does that make sense? So if it's off, we want it to be on. If it's on, we want it to be off, right? So this is how you do that. So there's a function called this.setState, and setState accepts a JavaScript object that is the new state that you want it to be. So instead of getting the state and then changing it, you have to give this function a new, completely new JavaScript object. So then you do button on, and then to do the opposite of whatever was before, we'll just do not this.state.button on. So again, this just gets the actual state. This just says get me whatever the opposite of that is, and then we make a JavaScript object with that value, and then we pass it to this.setState. Does that make sense? So the idea is now when we click it, this handle click function will get called, and then it will change the state. There's one other housekeeping thing we have to do. We have to bind the handle click function to the this keyword. This is a little bit of a clunky thing in React that hasn't really been developed out yet. Just know that this is something you have to write in your constructor every time you have a handler. All this is doing is just binding the this keyword to the method that we've just written. So with that, let's make sure that we know what the state of the object is, or the state of the component is. So instead of doing click me, I think more meaningful would be something like this button is. And then we can use a simple ternary statement in JavaScript. This is a very common way to do if-else in JSX. You'll see this a ton. So in this case, we want to look at, okay, is the button on or off? Well, we know that by looking at this dot state dot button on, and then ternary statement question mark. So if it's true, if this value is true, we want to say on, and if that value is false, we want to say off. So now you can see, okay, this updated, this button says now this button is off, and if I click it, it's going to say this button is on. And if I do this multiple times, it's just going to know exactly what to do, right? Okay. So let's recap. There's a lot, I know. But let's recap. So we got a component with state, this click me component, right? We got a constructor that holds that state in a this.state JavaScript object. All this does is just bind the click handler to itself, or to the this keyword. This is the actual click handler itself, so this method takes care of what happens when you actually make the click happen, or make a click event. And all it does is, of course, create a new JavaScript object and feed it whatever the opposite of the current one is. And then we just have a render method that returns the actual button that you're looking at here with this onClick function bound to it. Does that make sense? Cool. So this is a good example of the main basic concepts of React of what you'll be doing with like when you build real web apps. Yeah. With this onClick function bound to it. Uh-huh. Does that make sense? Yeah, so this is currently like just something that is a little bit clunky, doesn't really make a lot of sense, but because React is still in development, like it's something that people haven't really found a better way to do. And all it does is take this handle click method and we bind that method to the this keyword. So the idea is, right, like if we hadn't done this, this handle click method wouldn't know what this is referring to. So all we're saying is like, okay, we want this handle click function, when it's run, we want the this keyword to mean this exact instance. Yeah. So the idea is, right, like if we hadn't done this, okay, so with that, let's take a look at some real coding for you guys. When it's run, we want this keyword to mean this exact instance. Yeah. So the idea is, right, like if we hadn't done this, okay, so with that, okay. So the official React tutorial is the one we'll be following. So if you guys have your laptops, whoops. You guys can go to that address right there, reactjs.org/tutorial/tutorial.html. That'll put you on a page with where you can actually look at all the React official documentation as well, which is very helpful. We're going to be, if you are interested, I would say you should play around with the finished version first. So the tic-tac-toe board, as it will look like when you're done with it, you can go to that goo.gl link. And it gives you a nice little starter code package to start you guys off in a code pen with all the imports that I was talking about done for you. So, and that's linked in the tutorial as well. But here, I'll give you a little bit of a primer on what that looks like. Start you guys off in a code pen with all the imports that I was talking about done for you. Just use this. So, and that's linked in the tutorial as well. But here, I'll give you a little bit of a primer on what that looks like. All right, so you guys can skip all this. This is a concept that we covered, and this setup stuff you're not going to be worrying about, right? Here's the starter code link right here. And again, this is the same concept. Here's another good example of what a React component would look like. This one's displaying some kind of shopping list, and you'll notice, yeah, this is like basically HTML, right? Here's the starter code. Oh, one caveat that I should mention: if you're familiar with HTML, you know that classes and IDs are often used to hook up like CSS and refer to elements. In the case of React, class, the keyword class in HTML, in JSX is class name. So this word right here. That's a common gotcha that a lot of people miss when they're first doing React. You just have to remember that when you mean class in HTML like or CSS, when you're writing in JavaScript or JSX, you have to write class name. Just because, as you know, in JavaScript, class is a reserved word, so you can't be just writing that inside of JavaScript. So that's just one caveat that you should remember. But otherwise, yeah, you guys can get started right here at getting started. And I think it's a pretty good tutorial. It should be very self-explanatory. I'll be around to answer any of your questions. So, if anything's confusing or if you're stuck on anything, just call me over and I'll be happy to take questions. Otherwise, if you guys have like group questions or anything about what I've talked about so far, now would be the time, I guess. If anything's confusing or if you're stuck on anything, if not, go forth and conquer. Otherwise, if you guys have like group questions or anything about what I've talked about so far, now would be the time, I guess. But if not, go forth and conquer.